Well, good afternoon, everybody, and afternoon here, at least in Finland, and we're on Externalization of the Hierarchy, commentary number 82. We're gradually completing this wonderful book that advises us so carefully on how we can really help humanity or help hierarchy help humanity, either one of those. So, excuse me, we've come up to this section called Work in the Coming Decades. And this 1 hour, and it turned out to be 7 minutes. All right, so we begin now on page 631, and well, we're just about 1.5 years away from the time that Alice Bailey passed over in Sagittarius. I wonder if that means she'll be born with the sun in Sagittarius. DK seems to hint that is the case for people who die in a certain sign and then pick up the thread in their next life, in their next incarnation. So, work in the coming decades, page 631, we're 70 pages from the end of the book, and then, as you know, I have to go back and capture a little bit of the first part of the book, about 60 pages worth there. Okay, this is the last Wesak message I intend to give you. In 1949, I shall have completed 30 years of carefully planned and meticulously outlined work. It certainly shows you, doesn't it, that people like Master Decay are leaving nothing to chance. Maybe there were other books that Alice Bailey could have written. I've heard stories about these, but in any case, DK seems to say that what he intended to write with her will have been written by 1949. This work I undertook under cyclic law related to the periodical giving out of the esoteric teachings. So we don't know those cycles, but probably they have something to do with the second ray cycle, which is a 500-year cycle. At least that's given to us that way. In order to aid humanity and the work of the hierarchy, to both of which I happen to belong. So when we read in the rules for disciples and initiates of the Chohans, they are no longer men as are the masters. We realize that Master Decay is a master but not a Chohan, because he says he does belong to humanity as well as to hierarchy. I think by this time it had been given out who he was. Just an error on the part of Alice Bailey, and one that could be used to test the attitude of the students who received notification. He was going to remain simply as the Tibetan, but that was altered. On November 19th, okay, well, here he spells it out. On November 19th, 1919, I made my first contact with AAB. So it's Scorpio, almost into Sagittarius. And I have worked steadily with her ever since. However, it says much to her distress and dismay. What did she say in her autobiography? I'm no darn psychic, something like that. But he proved to her the value of what he was to impart, and he simply asked for a fair hearing, which she gave him. The books I then planned have been well nigh finished. The various phases of the work, which were a part of the preparation for the reappearance of the Christ, have taken form and should go forward with gathering momentum during the next 20 years. So some of these, of the subject matter in these books were not yet in book form, because they went out, as lesson sets, and then only later, some as late as the early 1960s, were they published in book form. So here he is precise about the date, and I have some astrological friends who are deeply into it, and they have tried to make sense out of this date from an astrological perspective. The two major ideas, which it was my task to bring to the attention of humanity everywhere throughout the world, have been securely anchored, if I may be permitted to use such a term, and these constitute by far the most important aspect of the work which I have done, and these formulated ideas are. Okay. So DK is reviewing what he has done with Alice Bailey, and he's trying to give us that sense of proportion which will allow us to evaluate properly. He's poured forth information so voluminously that we have to maybe know what is most important. I think it's probably very difficult for any one person, individual, to cover or even become familiar with all that he has written. So these formulated ideas are the announcement of the existence hitherto unrecognized of the new group of world servers. This is an effective group of workers intermediate between humanity and the spiritual hierarchy of the planet. Well, okay, the most important of his teachings are being brought forward here. These formulated ideas are, okay, and maybe I'll put this in blue just to keep things distinct. That's about all the value of my colors here these days. I used to write with 4 or 5 different colored pens in my hand and just switch back and forth. And I discovered another person also an Aries type who was doing the same thing. And then number two, the statement sent out lately in connection with the reappearance of the Christ and for the immediate consolidation of the work of preparation. Well, these, he tells us, are the most important, the new group of world servers and the reappearance of the Christ, the announcing of that intended reappearance relatively lately, where he discusses the probability and, in fact, almost really the certainty that the Christ will appear in bodily recognizable form. Probably in his Maya Varupa, no longer looking like the now Master Jesus, whose image we may well have, given the Shroud of Turin. All else that I have done in the service of the hierarchy is of secondary importance to these two statements of spiritual fact. So the Tibetan puts everything in proportion now, and although so much of what he has given is of profound interest, especially to the esoterically inclined along the third ray line of the second ray, the most important are these two things: the new group of world servers and the actual statements which make clearer what the reappearance of the Christ is and actually who he is, to correct those old erroneous ideas so propagated by the limited thought forms which are popular with the churches. These contribute by far even the most important aspect of the work which I have done. And maybe that would not be suspected by those who have read his books. After all, in a way, he's saying that a treatise on cosmic fire, that great continuation of the secret doctrine, is a secondary offering, though necessary, of course. Just the way it is necessary to finish, or it was necessary to finish the work, which he talks now about not being completed. A fifth volume of a treatise on the seventh ray, seven rays, remains to be finished, as does the second volume of Discipleship in the New Age. There is nothing else. There's nothing else. What remains, therefore, can easily be accomplished before my term of 30 years comes to an end. My term of 30 years. He had to time that so well, and that's the reason for his meticulous planning. Well, when you think about what he has really given, it would have to be planned meticulously. I remember prowling around a little bookstore called the Metaphysical Bookstore back in the 1960s and running into the Tibetan's books in hardcover, of course, at that time. It was a long time ago, 50-something years ago. Wow, 50-something years ago. And I opened a book and it said Atma Buddhi Manas. At the time, I didn't know very much about all this, and I kind of closed the book and said, well, later, because I was working on the secret doctrine, maybe little realizing that one thing led to another, and that I had probably run into either cosmic fire or the rays and the initiations, where Atma Buddhi Manas was outlined. Anyway, the gift, more and more one realizes, has been stupendous and meant for humanity, and not to be the sole province of a few people who may pride themselves on the fact that they received it just a little bit before everybody did. He said that would immediately prove their unfitness for the work to which they were called. Other work awaits me under the reorganization of all the hierarchical efforts incident to the reappearance of the Christ and the closer relationship which will then be established between humanity and hierarchy. This is an important hint. The work of hierarchical reorganization is at present largely internal and concerns not humanity at this time. Other work awaits me under the reorganization of the hierarchical efforts incident to the reappearance of the Christ. And, DK is working in a major second ray ashram under the guidance of Master Kuthumi, who is the master with the greatest, whose ashram has the greatest responsibility in regard to the reappearance of the Christ, or preparing men's minds and hearts for that. So maybe DK will tell us again before long what it was he was doing these 100 years, or, well, how many years would it be? More like 75 years, 76 years, 75 years between his last utterances through Alice Bailey and his intended continuation of this series of bridging treatises. So other work awaits me under the reorganization of all the hierarchical efforts incident to the reappearance of the Christ. That's an important statement. And, some people imagine that DK, who said he was not looking for any new stenographers, is somehow talking to them with a continuation of the teaching at a time before he said he would again begin. Their own ignorance or ambition makes it possible for them to speak that way. I take the master at his word. He, will have some internal communications with the people in his ashram and, those who may be working in the outer world, but the third series of bridging treatises has not yet been offered. I have made it entirely clear to all of you what is the work which you should do, and I have no intention in this final message, it must have been met with some pain, of pleading with you to do it beyond asking you to carry on where I leave off. I refer, of course, to my exoteric work. Well, I think he had 51 students, something like that, 50, 51. And when it was all over and the dust cleared, 8 out of them, I think that was the number, remained steadfastly involved in doing the work which he proposed must be done. Of the triangle's work, it must go on, he said. It must go on. And of course, there's so much about the will to good and goodwill that the promotion of goodwill through world goodwill and the stimulation of goodwill, however it can be found, had to go on. And the preparation for the New World religion through the full moon work, and now some people have taken up new moon work, essential. In Rays and the Initiation, he again lists the importance of the material he's given out, and work or word about Shambhala is the first. And then the new discipleship, the second, and then the new, the science of the 7 rays, I think the third, and then esoteric astrology, the fourth, and when it comes to the 5th, I think it's the new world religion practices in the outer world through the rhythm of the full moon meditations, and then 6th, the training that he had given out for disciples as found in Discipleship, especially Volume 1, and to a certain extent Volume 2, a training manual for initiation. I'm quite convinced that we recipients of his largesse under cyclic law don't really know the treasure we have and how that treasure could be shared with humanity through our persistence in making it, in presenting it in a reasonable manner. That the work I am now doing was definitely ending. In 1949 was quite unknown to AAB and has no relation whatsoever to the fact that her health is precarious. It has, however, some relation to the fact that she has resumed more active work as a disciple in the ashram of her own master after 28 years of service in mine, from 1919 to, 1948. It's the end of 1919. Before I began the work of the past 3 decades, I knew exactly the time I had in which to bring about the results desired by the hierarchy. All has been meticulously, there's that word, the second ray of meticulous entirety. All has been meticulously carried out under the most clearly envisioned plan. Well, we would expect that of a master, especially one with such a high intellectual caliber. See, not all masters have that kind of intellect. There are some that are masters of the wisdom that tend to have that, and maybe the lords of compassion like Master Jesus and Master Serapis are gifted differently. which does not mean they don't have a great mind. When you listen to the presentations of the Master Serapis, they always, in the few sentences DK gives us, demand a quite penetrating use of the intuition. Not easy to decipher at all. There's so much that's mysterious about the work of Master Serapis, and even now he has withdrawn and left the management of his great fourth ray ashram to, I think, Master AP. DK tells us P is not the correct letter exactly, but if you add an A in front of it, I think you get the correct letter. Apollodorus Irenaeus, not just Polydorus, but Apollodorus. Well, anyway, he's going on and telling us about his work, which is always interesting to get it, if we want to get it straight and not exaggerate. First, there was the necessity to find the nucleus of people through whom I had to work. The first step was therefore the writing of certain books which would carry the new teaching and act therefore as a selective agent for the discovery of those who would work in the new and emerging cycle. So the magnetism operating through the books that he wrote drew certain disciples who had, it appears, a rather long association with him under different types of relationships. And they were often in the arcane school, but not always. And he drew them into cooperation and offered them a chance to work together with a project out of his ashram. See, Alice Bailey, in a way, did double service on loan to the Master DK to work in his ashram, but really a high disciple in Master KH's ashram. And then apparently moving back in that direction as the planned work of Master DK began to come to an end, at least in this phase, the second phase. The starting of the arcane school, he says, by AAB was only incidental to this objective. And, this is, let's just say, MDK's planned objective. Regarding his own ashram. Its aim is to train those disciples who can implement the plan and thus prepare for the reappearance of the Christ. And this it has been doing for almost 100 years. The arcane school can therefore provide a trained body of workers from which he, selected the workers that he needed as a nucleus of his work to be carried forward. He had, of course, certain high hopes, but and in some ways, the training he offered through discipleship in the New Age was a great success for the individuals, but not so much for the kind of group achievement. He had hope, but then, the tremendous battle between the forces of light and darkness ensued in a way which, was it surprising? Well, it probably was not a foregone conclusion. The war had gone underground after the First World War, and maybe could have been kept subjective, but it was allowed to precipitate because of humanity's negligence or inability to care sufficiently about what was really happening. And, the disciples were part of that inadequate expenditure of energy to forestall the war precipitating upon the physical plane in the second phase. Anyway, there were surprises along the way. I think the hierarchy was surprised when the Lords of Liberation intervened toward the end of 1942 and the beginning of 43, when the sun moved northward to prevent the secrets of atomic energy from reaching the Axis powers through Germany. They were packing their bags, to put it colloquially, and they thought that humanity would go down to defeat. I think it was a surprise for them that there was such an intervention. Well, anyway, the Arcane School started. Was it 1922? Right in there somewhere, the early 20s. 10 years after that, he says, I began to expand the range of contacts, and the teaching began to reach thinkers on continents other than the American. As a result, I began to form my own ashram. Of course, as I recall, even from 1875, when Master DK was made a master, there was work to be done preparatory to the forming of his own ashram. And maybe 1925 was a pivotal time, so now we're talking about the early 30s. As a result, I began to form my own ashram because other thinkers were contacted and the range of his work widened, and to find people in all countries who were disciples, qualified as such, but who needed the impact of the influence of the second ray ashram. He's giving us a recounting of how his work proceeded, and it is refreshing to have it delivered directly to us rather than to have to guess about certain things. When this was done, the major part of the second decade of my work became possible, and I therefore wrote a pamphlet entitled The New Group of World Servers. So the second decade was pretty much from, well, we can generalize and say from 30 to 40, 1930 to 40. So he wrote this pamphlet, and in it he says, I called attention to the fact that there existed upon the earth, in every nation, men and women who, in some form or another, recognized the spiritual hierarchy of the planet, who had a quality of non-separateness definitely present, or either rapidly developing or else rapidly developing, and who were gathered together in no limiting organization, but primarily by the trend of thought and habit of their activity. So this is what united them, and not some limiting organization. They constituted a group who were subjectively, spiritually, practically, and openly creating a new form of human relationship. This new relation resulted in mutual understanding and a mental cooperation which recognized no barriers or national limitations. On the inner side of spiritual incentive and endeavor, they work today as one group. On the outer side of world affairs, they may not be aware of each other physically or arrive at any open contact, though it should be easier now. Yet they are animated by the same principles and are carrying forward in all nations and in every great department of human thinking and planning a similar work. So in the second decade of his work, he really strongly called attention to the new group of world servers. This almost seems like the pamphlet, My Work. Maybe it is. Or became that. We'll just have to see. So the major part of his work had been accomplished. Okay. For the second decade. Yeah. And remember, we just read it, that the alerting of humanity to the existence of the new group of world servers was considered among the two most important offerings that he had made. So he's going decade by decade to explain to us what it was he was doing. All right. So now he goes on to the third decade. You know, we're familiar with the idea that with Alice Bailey, he accomplished 30 years' work. Just think of the kind of estimation he had to give to her abilities as well, to her stamina, to the events of her life. And yet many unforeseen things arose within humanity, and still he had to stick to his schedule. In this decade, he says, in this decade of my work, two major activities were inaugurated. This is the 40s. The creation of the triangles and the formation of the men of goodwill. And these are just on the verge of a major creative activity. In which so many of us are involved, I think especially in the triangles work. They constitute an effort to energize and relate members and adherents of the new group of world servers, and particularly in the organization of men of goodwill, to find and mobilize the groups formed by the new group of world servers throughout the world, and so bring added strength to all of them by swinging into a massed effort. Men of prayer, men of good intention, and those who believe in the divine will to good, plus those who implement it through love, no matter what they mean by that vague term. Thus, a nucleus of a great synthesis was brought about in this second decade, and it will have lasting effects upon human living and design. Okay. Now, is he talking about the third decade or the second? Well, in this decade of my work, well, let's see. I'm not quite sure. The major part became possible. Well, let's just see. He says in this decade, because after all, he is writing in the 40s, 48, which is the third decade of his work with Alice Bailey. So let's go on and see. It looks like, in fact, it's still part of the second decade. Appears to be. So I'll say still appears to be part of the second decade. So it all depends what the word "this" means. Owing to planetary frustration and the enhanced activity of the forces of evil that maybe came on stronger than was ever anticipated by the hierarchy, the work of the triangles and the men of goodwill has been more slowly formulated than had been originally expected. But this has been through no fault of theirs. This period of frustration will be over before very long, and a greatly increased momentum will be the result. For this increased response upon the part of the public, you should now lay your plans. So, quite apparently, the word "this" continued to refer to the second decade and the warring forces of opposition created a situation of frustration and delay. Okay. What is in a pronoun? In the third and final decade, too much astrology. In the third and final decade of my work, the time and opportunity came to announce in a new and more emphatic manner what all the world religions have proclaimed, that with due preparation and the establishment of a pronounced tendency towards right human relations, the time had come when the Christ could again appear and take his rightful place as world teacher. So now, no question about the meaning of this. Okay. The reappearance of the Christ and the announcement thereby, or in relation to. So let's just see ROC and this is triangles and men of goodwill. We call it world goodwill now. And the arcane school, the first, finding the nucleus. Okay, so this is marking out the Tibetans' intended work and finding the nucleus of workers. Okay. So the big announcement was in this third decade, the externalization of the hierarchy intended and the reappearance of the Christ, climaxing that whole process. The emphasis has never before been laid upon the needed work of preparation. The results of the pronouncement have not yet had time to make themselves felt, but the next 10 years will reveal the full import of what has been done. And I guess we're speaking into the late 50s. Alice Bailey would have passed on in 49, but DK is looking ahead 10 years from his writing here up to 1958, or at least until the end of the 50s. Okay. Now, with that pronouncement, my planned work was brought to a finish. The book, which will indicate the proximity of this happening, I guess the reappearance of the Christ, and the lines along which the New World religion will be promoted is now in the press. This is in 1948. And early on in 48, relatively, about a year and a half before the end of the 30 years' work. I would call your attention to the fact that the general concept of a world savior, always attached to the office of the Christ, no matter by what name the exalted Son of God may be called in any world cycle, is in reality closely related to the far more important function of world teacher. So what is he saying? world teacher is more important than world savior. Yes. So the planned work that he had meticulously foreseen proceeded. And then he adds a couple of things, people love to be saved, for it ignores their own immediate responsibility, which teaching definitely emphasizes. It must be remembered that it is the teaching given by the Christ which saves humanity, not any symbolic death upon a cross. Men must save themselves by their reaction and their response to the teaching given in its purity by the Christ. This is a point which should be forcefully instilled by all of you. It is not man-made interpretations which save a man, but his self-initiated application of his own understanding of the teaching. This must be brought today to the consciousness of as many human beings as the followers of the Christ can reach. So the old debate about are you saved by faith or works? Although faith is necessary, it appears that works are the main means of salvation. It is, I'm going to build this up. It is not man-made interpretations which save a man. Save for what? Well, release him from the confines of the dense levels of the cosmic physical plane, but his self-initiated application of his own understanding of the teaching. Nobody can make you do it. You have to want to do it yourself and then to do it. And this it is that has to be brought to the attention of the people. So many people are quite happy that Christ does the saving, and all they have to do is believe that Christ does the saving, and then they're saved because they are a believer. Well, we can see that this is a somewhat childish notion, and it only goes so far. Yes, faith is needed, but if you have the faith, you will apply the teaching under self-initiated effort. So here you have, says the Tibetan, a brief account of the work which I undertook on behalf of the hierarchy and for the Christ, whom I most reverently regard as my master. So, although, is Master Kuthumi like an elder brother? He is, I think, a master in relation to Master DK, but here we have it. This is Master DK's assessment of where he stands in relation to the Christ. So it's good to have the summary of how he undertook things, the gathering of the human resources, the people, the nucleus, the announcement of the new group of world servers, and then the triangles and world goodwill or men of goodwill, and then the reappearance of the Christ, the externalization of the hierarchy and the reappearance of the Christ, the announcement in the third decade. Well, many of us will be charged with teaching humanity in the future, and we can take our example from the meticulous planning of the Tibetan. So the Christ, whom I most reverently, and of course the Tibetan has that quality of reverence and devotion, whom I most reverently regard as my master. We also have to remember his European incarnations, probably, Cleinias, the just Greek, who was so helpful to Pythagoras, and maybe Plotinus, or Plotinus, however that is pronounced, maybe the foremost of the Neoplatonists who ran a school, among other things, a school for the education of young people. Maybe. We don't want to seize upon that as anything definite, but it will be made known to us in clarity, in exactitude, when we need to know. So anyway, this work has not been unsuccessfully carried forward. It's a modest statement. Many of you who read these words have done what you could to help, and of this I am not unmindful, nor is the hierarchy ungrateful. So obviously, opportunity will be offered to those who give. More will be given so that they can give again. Perhaps with a still clearer picture in your minds, you will be able to do still more. And never is the initiate, even the advancing disciple, satisfied with what has been given and what has been done. Always there are greater opportunities to give, which perhaps have not been taken, much to the regret of those who might have taken them. I could have done this, I could have done that, recriminations. Where is the disciple who is not at one time or another afflicted by recriminations? He goes on. I intend to indicate, still briefly, what should be done in the next 2 decades, the 50s and 60s, but would like, first of all, to touch upon the state of the world and refer to its condition, because they have both handicapped hierarchical effort and particularly what I sought to do, which was a major hierarchical enterprise, and yet at the same time they have cleared the way in a most extraordinary manner for the reappearance of the Christ. So he's going to factually talk about the state of the world, and he knows he's talking about a time when he will not be working with Alice Bailey, 2 decades ahead of her passing or of the completion of the 30 years work. Well, we've done about an hour here, but let's just keep going. And maybe we can extrapolate, and find that his indications are very helpful to us today as we attempt under oppression and attack, and yet under the effect of the emergence of the will in the people to carry on as best we can to promote the proper and timely externalization of the hierarchy and the reappearance of the Christ. Remember that these dates of externalization and reappearance are not set in stone. Conditions may be set in stone, the conditions which must exist, but in what year will they exist? That is the question. So he goes on, a little history here. When I began my exoteric work, obviously he had done a lot of esoteric work with Blavatsky, I had not expected to be frustrated, by the Second World War, or rather by the final phase of World War I. I mentioned that earlier, and perhaps it's because I, Cryptomnesia, read it earlier. I had not expected to be blocked, to be frustrated by the reemergent Great War that we knew or have come to know as World War II. The hierarchy had hoped that the lesson had been severe enough to force those changes which were essential to the future of mankind. See, even hierarchy does not know what humanity will do. This factor of free will has to be left inviolate, according to the Syrian law of freedom. There's so much the hierarchy could do to just impose the peace and impose temporarily better conditions, but then they would drive the unresolved evil underground and the evil within humanity, and it would simply emerge again at a later time, unredeemed. So the First World War, maybe some have seen recent films about that, and there was a film recently, 1917, I think it was called that. It was chilling, and how the fight proceeded and how difficult it was to deliver messages between different aspects of an advancing army. Carrier pigeons and secret missions. It's a touching thing, but I think there is a statue somewhere of a certain carrier pigeon that was carrying a highly important message. And, that message would save many lives, and the enemy troops were firing at it and wounding it, and this bird persisted to reach its target. I think where it died, but it had come through. It shows you that in the animal kingdom there are the seeds of heroism. It's a touching thing, and of course we read all the time of certain pets, especially dogs perhaps, who somehow, no matter what, carry through and are oftentimes responsible for the rescue of their masters. Anyway, but humanity, says the Tibetan, had not learned the needed lessons. As I have oft told you, the hierarchy, because of the divine principle of free will in humanity, cannot foretell how men will react in times of crisis. Once, and I recall the Tibetan saying, well, we know what will happen, but we are not allowed to say. But of course, that was not so much humanity's reaction as it was what kind of conditions will appear in which humanity would react or respond. But humanity had not learned the needed lessons from the disciplines of that 4-year shooting war, World War I, which was worse than anything seen heretofore, this trench warfare. The hierarchy cannot enforce the good way of life against normal human desire, for the good way of action must come from out the very depths of human thinking and feeling, and must emerge as a free and non-supervised endeavor. The hierarchy may not take those possible steps which will prevent men making mistakes. For it, there we have it. At the end of 1942, before the sun moved northward, the hierarchy was preparing to retreat still more inwardly because they looked at how humanity responded, and in their estimation, humanity was going down. But then, for whatever reason and under whatever circumstances, the Lords of Liberation were reached by the invocation of human beings, whether conscious or inchoate and unconscious, and they responded in such a way that the war was internally won and hierarchy needed not to retreat. The retreat, of course, would have been to preserve spiritual values and somehow to lessen, although it's hard to imagine, somehow to lessen the consequences of humanity's defeat. Well, we're not in the position of hierarchy, so we cannot really know the details. DK says, I can't elaborate on this decision of the Lords of Liberation. He tells us that it was based upon being reached, and he tells us a little bit about what they did. So the good way of action has to come out of the very depths of human thinking and feeling and must emerge as a free and non-supervised endeavor. It's all part of the Syrian law of freedom, along with the law of karma and the great sensitivity that comes to us via that star. The hierarchy may not take those possible steps which prevent men from making mistakes, for it is through those mistakes that men learn, quote, by the means of evil, the good is best, as your great initiate poet has expressed it. Now, who is that initiate poet? Is it Browning? I'm not sure. By the means of evil, that good is best. So if I were to, try to look that up, I'm not going to do too much switching around here. So you're still probably looking at what I've got on the screen. And is it Christopher Dawson? Can it be so? This is would be unexpected for me. Anyway, a great initiate poet, and it will take a little while to trace this. So we'll just have to leave that for the moment, but you can do the same thing I would. Look it up, look it up. Men learn, quote, by means of evil, that good is best, as your great initiate poet has expressed it. All that hierarchy can do is to, is to present the needed teaching which will direct man's thinking along right lines, to point the way of true relationships, and at the same time demonstrate objectively the nature of the bad way. This the hierarchy has always done. As a spiritual group, they can and do set their faces against selfishness, greed, and all that seeks to imprison the human spirit and impair its freedom. But, there are limitations here. And they tell us that we would learn nothing if we did not go through the experience of learning that by the means of evil, good is best. To illustrate, the hierarchy demonstrated against the totalitarianism which the two great powers, Germany and Japan, expressed when they precipitated the Second World War. This they still do and will continue to do when any aspect of totalitarian greed and aggressiveness in any form, subtle and undeclared or openly demonstrated, attempts to limit the freedom of the individual, the individual, this free spiritual man, no matter what point may be his evolution. I want to bring this out. But humanity had not learned the needed lessons. It's just like dealing with a child, what does it take for the lesson at last to be learned? And much frustration comes to parents when the children apparently do not learn. Of course, later, the lodging of the lesson may emerge at an unexpected time. And maybe there has been learning, but not immediate demonstration. But hierarchy cannot deprive us of the opportunity to correct our own misdeeds, because then they would make us weaker and less fit to become a master and a still higher initiate. We would be retarded, held back in our attempt so to become, because too much had been given. It's a hard lesson for parents, and of course, hierarchy has learned that lesson, even though it causes them, I gather from reading what DK has written, that it causes them some agony as they look on and wonder whether humanity will decide aright. Well, apparently at the end of 1942, the impression was that humanity had not decided aright. And this would have meant basically the enslavement of humanity, or even its destruction and the need to start all over again. But there is endless time in which to do that. As I may have mentioned, when the weaver brought the tapestry to Master Moria, as Akbar, was it? After working 10 years on it, Master M saw one thread out of place and demanded that the whole thing be taken apart and done again. You just would collapse with such an assessment, but it will be a lesson in the good and even the perfect that would never be forgotten and would stand in the future. Toward the end of the second decade of my work, totalitarianism reared anew its most evil head. So apparently it had done so even earlier in the First World War. And perforce the hierarchy took sides against this primary principle of evil, though never against any group of human beings. And please note this. There is the energy itself, and then there are the people who are the unfortunate victims of it through mediumship, perhaps, or susceptibility, carrying it out, maybe not even knowing really what they're doing. And this is an example of condemning the sin or the energy, but not the sinner. DK often talks about the unfortunate German people who were so mediumistic through their Piscean personality that they were easily impressed by these forces. The point I seek to make, says the Tibetan, is that the hierarchy is inflexibly against any demonstration of the principle of non-freedom, no matter what form it takes, but it is ever on the side of humanity. The First Lord of Liberation promotes freedom, then brotherhood and equality. The spirit of evil which animated German actions evoked every possible opposition from the forces of light and from their source, the hierarchy. And here the forces of light are not considered to be that very high shambolic grouping, but the forces of light in the world, stimulated by hierarchy. Today, the totalitarian evil is expressing itself through the planning of the Russian oligarchy, I guess those who are wealthy and seek to preserve their wealth, through the Zionist movement, and through all groups which seek to fetter and imprison the spirit of man. But the people under the sway of this evil influence and the scheming, that's a third-rate word, of these evil groups are never regarded in any light different to that of the rest of mankind. It's a keen discrimination. They are looked upon as glamoured, or as weak and ignorant, which they undoubtedly are, but they are never separated off in the thinking and planning of the hierarchy from the rest of mankind. I mean, they could have easily incarnated in earlier times in many other countries and will later after their German or Japanese incarnations. The evil must not be permitted or allowed to triumph, but the unhappy and glamoured exponents of this evil are loved along with the rest of mankind. This is a point which is hard for the illogical thinker to understand, but it expresses most truly the attitude of the Christ and of all who serve his cause. There are certain leaders who are deeply responsible for the ills that befall. But there are ordinary people who fall under the sway, and as people they are not blamed, though their ignorance is noted and their weakness. And hierarchy is against any demonstration of this evil, but keenly discriminative between the energy and the individual who is overcome by it. He does tar the evil that overcame Germany and the evil propagated through the Zionists. He tars them with the same brush. And that maybe was difficult to see in the victorious enthusiasm of the moment, but some saw it, and the results now demonstrate through an apparently intractable Middle East situation filled with hatred and the desire for revenge. Not easy, though, to see. I know that for many years the Jewish group has felt put down. I was there, and I was a young person, and I saw the responses to the 1967 war. It was almost like cheering at a sports game, who was winning, and oh, we won, that kind of thing, without looking at the origin and the consequences for the future. There was a sense of victory again. And with the founding of Israel, there was a sense of victory in those who had felt themselves oppressed. Just the way, let's say, the Germans after World War I, who had been so compromised in defeat, and under financial hardship, they felt a great exhilaration with the coming of Hitler. And even DK tried. He tried to see it in a positive light during that period of goodwill. Hitler, who lifted a distressed people upon his shoulders. But, when the true colors emerged for all to see, it became Hitler and his evil gang. Somehow he had summoned around him, was it 6 others maybe, who were sensitive to the, let's call it the dark side of the force, of the Shambhala force. It does take us right into Star Wars, but okay, they were able to appropriate Shambhala energy, which was loveless, involving maybe the third aspect of Shambhala energy, one that gave in to the demands of materialism. And DK talked about the materialism which would have resulted had Germany won the war. And he also pointed to Russia as capable of developing the greatest capitalistic system the world has ever seen, which for a communist country seems a shocking thing. But that, has not yet happened. And when DK uses the word capitalism, I don't think he can use it in a complimentary manner, because he has said elsewhere that capitalism has emerged and wrecked the world. So we have to learn to see through the eyes of the master. I think it's the name of a book by David Anrias, where he sketches his impressions of the appearance of the master. Because right now we see through our own eyes and we see a distorted picture. The vision of the master is a lot closer to the vision of the planetary all-seeing eye than we can ever come. Now we're in the second decade, he's talking about it, when he introduced the new group of world servers and world goodwill and or men of goodwill and triangles, and tried to develop the seed groups of 9. But this was a frustration eventually, because the second aspect of the war entered. With the focused entrance of greed, Hitler would always evaluate neighboring countries in terms of their natural resources. He was a Taurus, so that negative part of it is acquisitiveness. Where the focused entrance of greed and of totalitarian ruthlessness into the world arena, with that, much that I had planned and much that all of you were attempting to do met with frustration. The work of all disciples was in many ways greatly hindered and handicapped, though not from the long-range vision, but only from the angle of short-range action. I would ask you to have this in mind. The vision stands even when the immediate action is blocked. There was a time, we are familiar with Alice Bailey saying so, that they wondered, the workers at headquarters, whether they could even go on, whether they could buy the materials, pay the staff what little the staff received, pay the rent. Now, fortunately, they were not condemned to stop the work. It drew upon the generosity of others to sustain the work. So even when we are blocked in the foreground, we have to take the long-range vision and base our confidence upon it. Today, says the Tibetan, it would appear from all the indications and from the dominant world trends that the still unconquered greed of certain of the more powerful nations is undeniably rampant, and that we are therefore facing another period of frustration and of major world difficulty. Written in 1948, post-war. Feeling against Russia is running high among the Western powers. You know, we had all of these anti-communist spectacles, and in the United States, the McCarthy hearings emerged, and the two so-called spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were put to death for giving Russia atomic secrets. And all of this, you know, has its continuing effect on Roy Cohen, who was a mentor to our present president. So everything is connected. The links, the stream of evil, or less than good, is connected, and the stream of goodness is certainly connected. Feeling against Russia is running high among the Western powers. Stalin is still in charge. He died 5 years later after this was written, 1953, I believe, and is largely her own fault, though it is primarily based upon two main factors, one of them bad and the other good. So it's amazing how quickly after the war, it was realized that some of the bad old ways really did continue and led us into situations which even now have not been rectified. So the bad reaction is based on the same old triplicity: fear, greed, and jealousy. And from the angle of those three phases of selfishness is entirely justified. That fact in itself supplies a major difficulty. Think this out. Fear, retreat, that is, greed, aggression, and jealousy, evaluation, egotistical evaluation of the contrast between having and not having. Well, that's the bad reaction. Now, what's the good reaction? The good reaction is based on the frustration of the idea or concept of developing a unified, peaceful world, a world in which there would be no war and in which men could live at peace with each other and in security, and in which men everywhere could work relatively unopposed towards right human relations. This super world and this unified humanity is a true ideal, but is not a feasible project. Well, it will come about, but not immediately. That's pretty sure. And it has not yet come about. The peaceable kingdom has not arrived, and until the Christ reappears, it will not arise. So here is the bad reaction and the good reaction. So these are the two main factors because of which the Western powers were holding Russia in disregard or holding her in contempt or at least profound disagreement, treating her as an enemy, even though she had just been an ally just a few years earlier, and one must say an indispensable ally, indispensable. Her sacrifice in terms of loss of soldiers and civilians was much greater than that of any of the Western countries. Okay. So, Russia was also eager to see a true ideal enacted. And that ideal ran counter to the negative forces in such countries as the United States, or at least forces which were promoting greedy capitalism. It's all materialism, isn't it? You can see how much the ageless wisdom is needed to help people cease their grasping for what is evident but unreal. And the Buddha said right from the beginning, with the Four Noble Truths, that the cause of suffering is desire for that which exists within the phenomenal world. There is I think it's in the law of repulse under the third ray, where it tells the third ray type not to rush from point to point, nor be deluded by that which is unreal and passes away. If I could find it, I would, and maybe I can, as it tells us essentially the problem with materialism. Rush not. Okay, so let's see if I can find this. Yep, here it is. And I'll read this and try also to make this available to everybody in terms of sight. It's not, sometimes I forget, and then the rest of the program is ruined. But anyway, here it goes. The word goes forth from soul to form. These are techniques of integration. Be still. Learn to stand silent, quiet, and unafraid. He's talking to the materialist now. I at the center am. Look up along the line and not along the many lines, which in the space of eons you have woven. The Antikarana line is what he's talking about. These hold thee prisoner. Now the point, be still, rush not from point to point, nor be deluded by the outer forms and that which disappears. Behind the forms the weaver stands, and silently he weaves. That expresses the proper attitude which leads to integration. So this is page 360 of Esoteric Psychology, Volume 2. So, Russia has that sixth-ray personality and is filled with a certain type of idealism. It's true that capitalism has somewhat made its inroads, and there were many totalitarian abuses in the attempt to enforce the communistic ideal. But there's something in it about sharing, never achieved really, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. And you can see that there were idealists at work who were unrealistic about the state of development of mankind and sought simply to impose that very high type of demand upon people who were still relatively selfish. And certainly they were not initiates of the second degree, where that kind of sacrificial selfishness is overcome to a significant extent. Okay. So it was not feasible that this ideal be brought forward at that time. The startling thing, if you look at the horoscope of Stalin, he seems to have so much Capricorn, and in a way he does, but his sun sign, at least according to those who have investigated his date and time of birth as closely as possible, seems to be in the last degree of Sagittarius. Now, of course, there is the Scorpio influence, very, very strong, and the Pluto influence. And you do kind of wonder, is Sagittarius real in all this? Because he looks so very Capricornian, and he did his best to preserve the secrecy surrounding his time of birth. But, there's the idealist, and he did write a number of idealistic books about how he saw the principles of communism impressed, or to be impressed. Okay, so spiritual workers should face the various world alternatives. This is a tough one. And some of these things just have not yet played out. Thank goodness they haven't. But some of them maybe are closer to being actualities than we would like to admit. The alternatives: an all-dominant Russia, whose regime would cover the planet, enforcing her totalitarian interpretation of communistic doctrine. There is a right and true interpretation, maybe more exemplified by the Essenes in the early period of the Christ Jesus expression. Refusing freedom to the individual in the interests of the state. Well, that's just the basis of totalitarianism. It happened in Germany too. And because of a low opinion of the human masses that apparently they claim to exalt, everywhere standardizing her interpretation of democracy. Now, this is written in 1948, and Stalin was still very much in power, and he died a little later, 5 years later. Okay. Now, another one, another possibility. So this is how DK saw it, and we should evaluate what in fact did emerge, because we've had 75 years, roughly, 72 to be more exact, up to this point, to see what emerged. Number two, a world in which all nations live in an armed armistice. They're not fighting actively, but they are filled with the means of destruction of others and themselves, in which distrust is forever rampant, and in which science is prostituted to the art of destruction. We're there. In this world, an explosion must and will eventually take place, which will destroy humanity as once before it was destroyed. Not completely, maybe, but what's he talking about? Atlantis, or something we don't know about? According to the Bible and other world scriptures and the hierarchical records. Well, this is one of those sentences that rather sections that really gives you pause. Now, against this is the statement by Foster Bailey, who I think claims to have remained in touch with the Tibetan after Alice Bailey's passing. And in a book written in the early 50s, was it Changing Esoteric Values or Running God's Plan, something like that, said that the Tibetan had assured him that there would be no Third World War or atomic war leading to the destruction of humanity. Now, so many of the warning statements that we have found in this book and apparently in the introduction to the Problems of Humanity in its first edition. But, you know, science being prostituted to the art of destruction. And the inevitability of an explosion arising out of this armed armistice is stated unequivocally. It would happen if that's the way humanity chose to live. And here's another one. A world in which the United States proves itself to be the controlling factor after wiping out Russia. I mean, I suppose through atomic weaponry that did not happen, which she can well do if she acts now. So, you know, such figures as General Patton and maybe General MacArthur may have supported that kind of solution. It will be a predominantly capitalistic world run by several nations, but headed by the United States. A capitalistic nation is not necessarily wrong. Capital has its place, and Russia, the enemy of capitalism, apparently, is by no means free from capitalistic bias. You know, the largest capitalistic system the world has ever seen could emerge out of Russia, said the Tibetan. The motives of the United States are very mixed motives. Greed of money, or its equivalent, such as oil, and at the same time, sincerely good intentions for the establishment of human freedom in a democratic world, modeled, of course, on American democracy. Well, some of this has happened. In all cases here, some of these alternatives have occurred, but not all under any one number. Not all have thus occurred. And for that, we have to be grateful, at least with regard to these first three possibilities. Other motives are an appreciation of the armed fist, at the same time, a longing for economic sharing and for that essential kindness, which is such a strong American characteristic, a mass characteristic. Well, the mailed fist that we have been told the United States could shake over the world. The eagle symbolism is not very peace promoting. So the United States would, I'm very surprised to see, though, that the Tibetan talks here in 1948 about wiping out Russia. Obviously a terrible thought, given that Russia has to be the point of emergence of the new world religion, and great experiments in education have to come out of Russia. These mixed motives will produce eventually a very confused world, one in which it will be found that humanity has learned very little as the result of the World War and is acquiescent to the cycle of well-intentioned money control. Well, some of that has occurred as well. It is a confused world. The United States has been trying to force its type of democracy upon other countries. And you do wonder how much has been learned as a result of the World War. Not yet what hierarchy had hoped. And number 4, I don't think there's a number 5. No, there isn't. Number 4, a world divided into blocks for mutual and economic sharing. Of this, the proposed treaty between Great Britain, France, and the Benelux countries is a tentative example, though tainted by objectionable motives from the angle of the hierarchy. Blocks for mutual aid. Fear is the major factor producing this treaty, but it has in it, nevertheless, the seed of hope. You kind of wonder whether the EU grew out of this. European Union. There is nothing intrinsically wrong in any group of nations standing together for mutual aid and economic cooperation. The wrong factor comes in when they stand united against any other group of nations, and therefore against any group of human beings. It is this attitude, engineered and fostered by Russia, which has led to the relatively new concept of blocks against the Soviet bloc, as we're told. Now the word BLOC and BLOCK have a relationship that we should analyze. Along this line and with this attitude of antagonistic groupings, only disaster can lie. Well, this looks like the kind of world that could emerge. And, you know, we have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. None of these prevails anymore entirely, although the European Union is a formidable market, or has been. And the idea sounds like it's sponsored by Master R as the regent of Europe and the regent of the United States. So the blocks for, which also have turned into blocks against, the prevailing United States, having wiped out Russia, and with that so many possibilities of goodness emerging from Russia, which are predicted, and the armed armistice, which seems a very dangerous status quo. One mistake and that's it. The missiles start to fly, and maybe now the lasers, and an all-dominant Russia enforcing the totalitarian interpretation of the communist doctrine. These are the various world alternatives. Now, what, in your opinion, do you think has arisen? Just pause for just a moment here and consider. We have emerged through Cold War situations. There's still aggression, takeovers of the property of other nations. Recently, Russia has been involved in that. There's still destabilization and the seeking of regime changes. There's no world war of a shooting kind that's going on now, but the danger of in a nuclear world of antagonistic nations is present. There are nations run by people who are nothing short of megalomaniacs, which leads to a great deal of instability and danger. The world is living a kind of armed armistice in which nations that DK said were essentially untrustworthy are possessed of atomic weapons. It's not just a means of destruction in the hands of such as the United States, Great Britain, France, I guess among the trustworthy nations mentioned at the time or implied. Would Russia now be considered such a nation? For a long time it's had atomic weaponry. North Korea would not be considered trustworthy. Would Israel be considered trustworthy? It has atomic weaponry. Everybody concedes. I think Iran, working to develop atomic weaponry, and maybe Saudi Arabia, would neither of them be considered trustworthy. So the armed armistice does exist. Russia is not all dominant, and the United States is slipping from a position of being the controlling factor, and certainly has the superpower Russia to contend with. Now we have to remember that the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia are considered three highly important nations who should be related productively towards each other and who hold the fate of humanity in their hands. What is the relationship between them? Well, a mixture of tense and not tense. Here he gives capitalism a chance. Elsewhere he says it has wrecked the world. The factor of greed is operative in the higher financial echelons of the three main nations who are to cooperate and help save the world, and also in other financial situations in other countries. Greed persists, and now China is emergent with its Taurus soul and its Libran personality, both of which are ruled by Venus, Venus being a planet of finance in its lower aspect. So we see it's a mixture, isn't it? And it is confusing. And you kind of, the European Union has been a block for mutual support. But now, foolishly, a country like the United States treats dictators and totalitarians as friends and former allies, not exactly enemies, but certainly not preferred countries. So we're still in the confusion. And we still suffer from antagonisms, which lead to a very unstable situation, especially since we're living in that armed camp, that armed armistice. The war, which we can assume may have three phases, is underground and being fought underground. It's not yet an emergent third phase of a great war, which is a shooting war. There are eruptions, and great nations, great in population and power, often fight the war through proxies, through those who are carrying out the desires of the greater nations. And this is going on with Iran and Saudi Arabia, let us say. Though neither one of those could be considered among the greatest nations, still they use proxies. Russia does, as in the Ukraine at this time. The United States has always used proxies, and we had, for many years, the CIA undermining anything that smelled of communism. Not a very rational attitude when Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam was a man who idealized Lincoln. But it's not about Lincoln or any avatar, it's about greed. It's about privilege. Those are the things which some of the extremely rich, or sometimes it's said obscenely rich and unsharing people and groups are desiring, not to idealize the greatness of Lincoln through the party of Lincoln, but to seek always their own egotistical advantage. So we're still in plenty of trouble. Blocks in themselves can be good and proper if they follow lines of natural cleavages, of language differences, and of cultural directions. They are or can be essentially right if they are formed for economic, educational, religious, and social aims, and can therefore provide no true cause for alarm. Such blocks would be cultural and not militaristic, economic and not greedy, and they could provide a normal and progressive movement away from the separative nationalism of the past and towards the distant creation of the one world and the one humanity. This will someday be seen, but the time is not yet. they could be good if following the non-violent possibilities leading to greater light and unity that Master DK is here suggesting. We want to make sure that we do not somehow take a particular approach and say that it's always bad. Everything depends on the motive. And, you know, for so many years during the Cold War, the Soviets had a great block against. And maybe to a degree that was forcing the formation of the European Union to gain in strength and resist, because Europe had pretty well been divided up by the Axis powers. And aspects of it were also claimed by Russia or the Soviet Union. Now that ended with Gorbachev and the end of the Berlin Wall and the falling apart of the Soviet Union in its present, in its structure, such as it was at that time. Then a new balance of power emerged. But unless there is some wisdom in the leadership, there's not much good to be hoped, and some of the nations now are suffering from extreme ignorance and selfishness in their leadership. Mankind, now this is really important, mankind is not ready for some super government, nor can it yet provide the unselfish and trained statesman that such a government would require. You know, one almost thinks about the philosopher king here, or queen. You know, it's a human being. And yet there are more seeds of danger in this concept. As yet, there are more seeds of danger in this concept than there are of helpfulness. You know, a great opportunity for totalitarianism. Nevertheless, it is a dream which will someday materialize after the creation and the functioning of blocks. You know, they are transitional structures, have provided how men should work and live together. We can't take the whole thing right now. We can take aspects of it and move slowly in the transition towards the eventual global government. So it could be very oppressive if run by selfish and untrained statesmen, because the unselfish and trained statesmen don't yet really exist, at least at that time. And it doesn't look a whole lot better right now. The United Nations is still the hope of the world, because it had been established by this time in 1948, and can remain so. It doesn't say it will remain so, because always the sovereign, egotistical thought form will fight against it, just the way the ego fights against the group, the lower ego, that is. It is a great field of experimentation, but is suffering today from an initial error. And it's interesting to see what that error is and how it has worked out. That error was the admitting of a totalitarian power into its nations. For several long and terrible years, the forces of light had been fighting totalitarianism. In the early days of the post-war period, the nations compromised with principles and admitted Russia to the United Nations. Had they proceeded to unite all the other nations of the world on the sure ground of economic reform, of needed national reorganization, and of regional groups, a better term than blocs, Russia would have been forced to conform, for her very existence would have been at stake. An initial error can lead to much trouble, and it is this type of trouble which the United Nations today faces. Well, now we have China too, and it has developed since the days of the Cultural Revolution and the fanaticism of the Maoist doctrine. It has very much to offer, and Russia has very much to offer, but this is how DK sees it, an error at that time. And yet, as we see, hierarchy was not in a position, if it would obey the law, to force the United Nations to do the right thing as hierarchy saw that right thing. Well, maybe some of this has been corrected, and now there are regional groups that get together for economic consultation. It doesn't mean that selfishness is banished from their motives, but they are talking to each other. And also we do see other kinds of groups getting together to maintain their hold over financial resources, the financial resources of the world. There are some extremely wealthy people, and we have one person in the world heading towards becoming a trillionaire, not just a billionaire. And these days, to be a millionaire is not much. To be a billionaire is commonly discussed. How many billion are these people, quote, worth? And sometimes it's quite a high figure in the billions. Meanwhile, humanity suffers, and the children scour the garbage heaps for a little bit that may still be edible instead of rotten. Well, there's more. The ashram's concerned at the coming. I think the one we're just on now is April 1948. Let's see if I can persist a little bit. I have here given you, let's make sure that this is correct. I have here given you the possibilities with which the work is challenged and confronted. And again, I must refuse to foretell what will happen. It is not permitted. Now, does that mean he knows? Or he knows certain things, or even to attempt to say what will be is not permitted. I have felt it necessary to summarize the situation because it is this world that you and all men of goodwill will have to work for the next 20 years. This period of settlement will not be an easy one, in which the disciples of the Christ have to prepare for his appearance. Well, DK is describing the world as he sees it, and it relates to the 50s and 60s, as he is here at the tail end of the 40s, and his term of work with Alice Bailey is rapidly coming to an end. Maybe, yeah, the end of the 40s, in April, I think, 1968. And he talks about the last Wesak message. This is still a Wesak message. The 2 decades ahead of you are those in which you must bring to fruition the seeds which I have planted. Though I shall not be actively and outwardly working with you or communicating with you, as I have done over the past 30 years, 29 years, you will have my books, which will then be finished, and the relation which I now hold to you and to all the activities which I have helped you to inaugurate will remain basically the same. The relation which I now hold to you and to all the activities which will remain virtually basically the same. It will be more subjective, but many in the world today know the means of reaching me. Okay, well, this is the future at that time. And for us, the past that ended 50 years ago, ended, let us say, 1970, 50 years ago. The Christ whom I serve as a disciple and the spiritual hierarchy of which I am a member are drawing steadily nearer to humanity. In the past, I have used the statement to reassure you. The hierarchy stands. Today I say to you, the hierarchy is near. You can feel, an exhortation coming here on this last Wesak message that he plans to deliver in written form to his students of many years. The work that must be done in the 2 coming decades is as follows, and I shall not enlarge upon it because you have been trained to do it. You know what to do, and the responsibility is yours, as will be my unfailing help. So from the inner planes, he plans to stay in touch, to work to promote, and when he uses a word like unfailing help, it's not going to crash on the rocks of inconsistency. So what do you have to do? So, whoopsie. And I think I can do this better. And sorry for slight delay here. Okay, so advice. Regarding what his students must do in the next 2 decades. The 50s and the 60s. All right. So this will be not unfamiliar to us. We will recognize some of these directives. Number one, and this is one I memorized when I first saw it because I just knew it. This had to be the thing. Prepare men for the reappearance of the Christ. This is your first and greatest duty. The most important part of that work is teaching men on a large scale to use the invocation so that it becomes a world prayer and focuses the invocative demand of humanity. The main thing, and the main thing today too, in this period when more primitive and ecstatic versions of Christianity are arising. Martian religions are arising, whether through Islam or Christianity, maybe not so much through Judaism. It's not so Martian anymore. So prepare men's hearts and minds, really. Somewhere it says that, for the reappearance of the Christ. Enlarge the work of the triangle so that subjectively and etherically, light and goodwill may envelop the earth. And many of us, we know, have been trying to do this. Promote ceaselessly the work of world goodwill. Now it's called world goodwill, not just men of goodwill, so that every nation may have its group of men and women dedicated to the establishing of right human relations. You have the nucleus, and expansion must be undertaken. You have the principle of goodwill present throughout the world. The task will be heavy indeed, but far from impossible. These are the things he left us with, to do these things. And as always, we can measure the degree to which we are responding. Number 4, undertake the constant distribution of my books, which contain much, not all, of the teaching for the New Age. In the last analysis, the books are your working tools and the instruments whereby you will train your workers. See that they are kept in steady circulation, and the Lucis Trust has undertaken this and done very fine work. And of course, the appearance of the CD-ROM is a cause of celebration because it makes far more efficient the studies that we seek to undertake, and through which we can train those who work at the inculcation of New Age values. Number 5, endeavor to make the Wesak festival at the time of the May full moon, so it's tropical, a universal festival and known to be of value to all men of all faiths. It is, now this would be before the maybe 3.5 decades elapsed and the year 1981 or so had been reached, as Mary Bailey thought, and the keynote of the Wesak festival would be changing and a different mode of reaching people would be instituted. but about this there is still some degree of uncertainty. It is the festival in which the two divine leaders of the East and of the West collaborate together and work in the closest spiritual union. The Christ and the Buddha use this festival each year as the point of inspiration for the coming year's work, and see that you do likewise. The spiritual energies are then uniquely available. So still at that time, and I suspect today as well, the Wesak festival must be noted and celebrated no matter what is the modus operandi of reaching humanity at the time of the May full moon. A universal festival known to be of value to all men of good, of all faiths. So do that. Undertake the constant distribution of the books. Do that. Promote the work of world goodwill ceaselessly. Do that. Enlarge the work of the triangles, a work which must go on. Do that. And prepare men, somewhere it says men's minds and hearts for the reappearance of the Christ. But prepare men for the reappearance of the Christ. And I'm pretty sure somewhere we have the phrase, prepare men's minds and hearts. It softens it a bit for the reappearance of the Christ. And then point 6, discover the members of the new group of world servers whenever possible. I'm still remembering the meditation form, or the report form, for monthly submission in the Arcane School. Have you noticed, did you find any of those who are working with the new group of world servers? And strengthen their hands. Look for them in every nation and expressing many lines of thought and points of view. Remember always that in doctrine and dogma and in techniques and methods, they may differ widely from you, but in love of their fellow men, in practical goodwill, and in devotion to the establishing of right human relations, they stand with you. They are your equals and can teach you much. I remember the old days, a little more fanatical for me, when I memorized all these 6 points. They have since subsided from memory, but fragments and phrases are still remaining. There's no equivocation here. This is what we were set out to do, and we have to do that. And the Arcane School, Lucis Trust, has carried this forward in a very good way, and other groups also. And now, exhortation coming, can't you see it? What shall I say to you in closing, my comrades, my brothers, and my co-disciples? Even the word comrades is embracing of the true meaning of communism and not the totalitarian misinterpretation. I have said to you so much over the past years that there is little left to say. You have all you need wherewith to carry on the work. Impulse from the hierarchy through what I have attempted to do. I can only say that I have confidence in you. That's a good thing, to have the confidence of the master. And that I expect no slackening of effort from you. You are dedicated and consecrated and will remain so. He's establishing the possibility of firmness. He's aiding that. For the closeness of the hierarchy and the nearness of the Christ indicate to you increasing sources of strength. So, this is a charge. This is a charge. He knows that you must exhort, you must see to it that your invocation of your co-workers and students is sufficient to produce the evocation you seek. May the blessings or the blessing of the one whom we all serve, and that is the Christ, rest upon you all and upon all disciples everywhere. May you do your full share in helping men to pass from darkness into light and from death to immortality. There's a few left out there, but this would be sufficient. If we could do it, that would be indeed sufficient. So friends, this ends this particular section. I've gone on for quite a while, maybe about 2 hours and 40 minutes or something like that. And, we're on the cusp of doing program number 83, and this continues in 1948. And I think there's also in 1949 some kind of message, but this one being the last WASAC message. So let's see where we are here. What page? 642. And so, rather long program, but as I say, sometimes it is more efficient for me to do the longer program, even though it places a little bit more of a burden on you, because probably you're not going to listen to the whole thing at once. So 631 to 642. And program 32, and approximately 2 hours and, well, let's just say by the time I finish 45 minutes. Okay. So, right. So now I'll just capture this and go down to where we ceased. We are coming to some conclusions here, but in the midst of elaboration, nothing maybe goes quite as fast as one would hope, but then the in-depth is better. So this would be the end of 82, and 631 to 642, and it would be about 2 hours and roughly 45 minutes, maybe a tiny bit less. And we'll begin with number 83. And we don't know how long. Well, let's make sure I do that. UTES, we don't know how long that will be. Approximately 1 hour, I'll say. And XX minuets, MINUTES. And we'll start from page 642. And today is the 16th of June. And we'll continue when we continue. So much to think about and even more to do. And it has, the necessity for the doing has continued. And we are not in a position to slacken, as DK does inform us. He expects no slackening from us at all. So as we, go forward, there's that section coming up. And organizing the ashrams into form. This is just a half a year before Alice Bailey passes on. This is June 1949. And let's see, well, it's a long one. Very long. And then the effects of the externalization coming up. Maybe that's as far as we need to take it by the time we reach page 701. Well, here's yet one more. Ashramic adjustment to exoteric living. Still 1949. Her health is precarious, but she's still taking dictation from the master. An initiate disciple, advancing the cause of the divine plan, and meanwhile, helping all of us and even, providing for us our life's work. Yes. Okay, friends, so that's going to be it for now. And hopefully everything has been done properly. And when I can resume, I will resume. This will stop the recording. Lots of love, many blessings. Study hard, meditate deeply, and serve with all you've got. If any of us could really live up to that, it would be wonderful. So we'll see you soon.